Most New Zealanders would agree that New Zealand really is a wonderful place to live and raise a family, along with being one of the most democratic nations in the world. This was confirmed by the 2012 Democracy Index, which ranked New Zealand at 5th in the world. New Zealand certainly has led the way by being the first to give women the vote in 1893, and in 1994 it broke away from the traditional British voting system of first past the post to adopt the fairer MMP system. However, Better Democracy New Zealand has for some time now been raising concerns about the New Zealand political system and suggests that there really is a lack of true democracy in New Zealand. After all, voting once every 3 years doesn't make New Zealand a democracy. This documentary takes a closer look at the New Zealand political system and highlights where this lack of democracy exists and how this democratic deficit can be overcome. It's often assumed that members of Parliament sit in Parliament and debate the important issues of the day. After all, that's what we pay them for, isn't it? It may come as a surprise to many New Zealanders that Parliament is often empty and members often don't take a lot of interest in the proceedings.
And I was just checking on the Attorney General's well-being over there. Perhaps not so great just at the moment. He's gone. He's completely gone. That's terrific. Oh, there he is. Very good. So, just for Mr. Finnison.
Point of order, Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just seek your assistance and support, really. It's been indicated to us that there's a number of important pieces of legislation that are coming up very shortly. And I'm becoming a bit concerned that we're getting into a habit where we have to debate and vote on legislation before we've had a chance to properly digest it. And I'm just seeking your support to endeavour to get the Leader of the House, if you could put some pressure on the Leader of the House to provide bills to us earlier than perhaps half an hour before we have to actually debate and vote them.
In fact, the debating chamber really is a facade, and decisions are actually made behind the closed doors of the Cabinet meeting room by the Prime Minister and a handful of senior government ministers. But that's not all that happens in the debating chamber, because when members do turn up to earn their 140,000 plus salaries, the behaviour of MPs leaves a lot to be desired.
House. I've asked the member to leave the House. Would the member please leave the House? Thank you.
The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, that sort of insult really requires an apology, particularly from some illiterate woodwork teacher.
Order! The member knows that he cannot use points of order to abuse other members. He will now leave the House.
I've heard on a couple of occasions during question time today the Honourable Trevor Mallard interjecting exactly that. And offence on this occasion has been taken. I'd ask the member to withdraw and apologise.
Well, before I do that, Mr. Speaker, make it clear.
Order!
Well, I did not make the comment.
Well, the member will leave the chamber for the rest of the day.
For not making a comment.
Order!
For goodness sake.
The member will
Big
not...
statements, and Mr. Little's an angry little man.
Order!
He's an angry little man. And that's
order!
Actually, LSV is making a difference, and we've seen the numbers. Well, if you want to listen to the answer, then just zip it, sweetie, I'm getting there. So.
It's often said that the results of an election are dependent upon the leader of the party, and while New Zealanders admired Prime Minister David Lange in his famous "I can smell the uranium on your breath" speech, the behaviour of and the contempt our political leaders have for the New Zealand public leaves a lot to be desired. In fact, some would argue that it's all been downhill since Prime Minister Robert Muldoon turned up drunk in 1984 to announce a snap election to the New Zealand media.
So we've got a date, Prime Minister?
We've got a date, the 14th of July, which we've worked out at Government House as being the appropriate date.
That doesn't give you much time to run up to an election, Prime Minister.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
In 2004, on a radio BFM interview about genetic modification, Prime Minister Helen Clark showed her utter contempt for New Zealanders when she arrogantly announced, "I don't care if every New Zealander marches. We campaigned for GE in the election and won. End of story." Her successor, Prime Minister John Key, didn't show much more respect for more than 1 million New Zealanders who demanded changes to the MMP voting system. Estimated to have cost $1.6 million, recommendations by the Electoral Commission were swept aside by the government. When interviewed, John Key had this to say.
My view is, generally speaking, people are reasonably happy with the way MMPs operated.
So that's the end of the matter then?
As far as I'm concerned, yeah.
That produced a torrent of media protests and headlines, but so far all have failed to budge the Prime Minister from his point of view. A constitution is a powerful way for society to influence government, as it puts a check and balance on government powers, promotes accountability, and helps to protect the rights of minorities and all citizens. The Constitution also critically restricts what a government is able to do in terms of passing laws. There are two types of constitutions: a codified constitution, which is a single document, and an uncodified constitution, which may exist across a number of documents. New Zealand's system is an uncodified system. Furthermore, constitutions may be flexible or rigid in terms of their potential for challenge and modification. Britain and New Zealand are examples of flexible constitutions and are relatively easily changed, most often by a single majority in Parliament. Parts of the New Zealand Constitution, such as Section 268 of the Electoral Act, are entrenched and require a 75% majority in Parliament or a majority in a referendum to be changed. However, this is rather misleading because a simple majority in Parliament can remove the entrenchment. For example, the New Zealand Bill of Rights could be changed with a simple majority in Parliament. New Zealand has undertaken a constitutional review and an electoral system review of MMP, but as is often the case, if governments don't like the recommended changes because it doesn't suit their party, then nothing will happen. These are important considerations, because if a government can change the rules of the game with a simple majority in Parliament, this leaves the political system open to abuse and at the whim of the controlling party in government. The goal of an upper house of Parliament is to represent different interests from those of the House of Representatives. The role of an upper house is to revise and scrutinise legislation coming from the House of Representatives and acts as a check and balance, perhaps even ensuring the protection against tyranny of the majority. It also has the ability to delay or block controversial legislation. In 1951, the government of the day removed New Zealand's upper house from Parliament. During the first Labour government of 1935 to 1949, the upper house had become markedly supportive of Labour. When the National Party came to power in 1949, it implemented an election policy to have it removed. There was little opposition to this because the Prime Minister of the day had promised to search for a better type of upper house. This never eventuated, and this has now created a concentration of power in the Cabinet, as previously mentioned, and therefore it has removed a valuable part of New Zealand's democratic system, even though it could be argued that in a small country like New Zealand, an upper house still isn't needed, and that there are better tools available to the public as a check and balance on government in between elections. Originally, there were no political parties in the New Zealand Parliament. Politicians were not obligated to vote in any particular manner, so therefore every vote in Parliament at the time could be considered to be a free or conscience vote. The first political party in New Zealand, the New Zealand Liberal Party, governed from 1891 until 1912, and party MPs were expected to vote along party lines. a tradition that has continued until this day. Free votes came about because of new drinking laws being proposed towards the end of the 19th century, and were a safety valve for parties because some party members felt so strongly about certain issues, and this threatened to split some parties apart. An MP is totally at liberty to vote on a conscience vote however that member chooses, even if their electorate is overwhelmingly against the beliefs of their Member of Parliament. The question that needs to be asked here is whether the morals and principles of an MP are more important than the morals and principles of voters. Let's now take a look at those morals and principles. In 2005, former MP Donna Awatiri Huara was jailed for 2 years and 9 months for stealing from a Maori trust set up to help underprivileged children while she was a Member of Parliament. In 2009, former MP and Government Minister Taito Philip Field was sentenced to 6 years jail on 11 charges of bribery and corruption while he was a Member of Parliament.
It's the end of a long road for former MP Taito Philip Field.
Makes a total sentence that you are required to serve of 6 years in prison.
In 2010, MP and Cabinet Minister Pansy Wong resigned from Parliament over allegations she abused her parliamentary travel perks. In 2010, Government Minister Shane Jones was caught charging pornography to his ministerial credit card.
For sheer front, you've got to give it to Shane Jones. He lined up today admitting to charging porn movies onto his taxpayer-funded ministerial credit card. He and a number of fellow former ministers have had their expenses hung out for all to see, and it's disturbing reading.
2010 was a bad year for politicians, and David Garrett resigned from Parliament after it was revealed that he used the identity of a dead infant to get a passport in 1984. In 2011, MP Darren Hughes resigned after being the subject of a sexual complaint to police from an 18-year-old student. In 2012, Cabinet Minister Nick Smith resigned from all of his cabinet portfolios after it emerged he had at least twice intervened in friend Bronwyn Puller's ACC claim while he was ACC Minister. In 2013, MP and ACT Party leader John Banks denied knowingly receiving donations from millionaire Kim.com for Mr Banks' 2010 Auckland mayoral campaign.
Millionaire being investigated by the FBI or Minister John Banks. The ACT leader now denies phoning Kim.com to thank him for a $50,000 mayoral campaign donation.
But .com says he did after Mr Banks told him to split the donation so he wouldn't have to reveal where the money came from. Police are now investigating this donation.
Ring someone to thank them for an anonymous donation. I wouldn't ring an anonymous donator to thank them for an anonymous donation.
That brings us to May 2013. The infamous, "Do you know who I am?" While one MP was jailed for perverting the course of justice, the government itself has been busy perverting the course of legislation. Urgency is a process used in Parliament to extend the sitting time of the House to enable it to complete certain business. A motion for urgency can only be moved by a minister of the government, and then the sitting hours of Parliament are extended and question time is cancelled. It's then possible for a bill to be passed through the usual 3 stages without select committee or public input. This has been happening for a long time, but in 2011 the government forced through an enormous amount of legislation under urgency, and the media, along with professionals in the field, were not surprisingly upset. Jonathan Tem, President of the New Zealand Law Society, for the third time since the national government of the day was elected, took the previously rare step of criticising the government for an emerging trend in legislation being passed under urgency, which he argued was usurping the role of Parliament and threatening the rule of law in New Zealand. Mr. Tem said, "History shows unconstrained power is abused." International laws are growing in stature and often influence governments who sign up to these laws, which can even take precedence over domestic laws. Once the government signs New Zealand up to such treaties and laws, it's then obligated to adhere to any subsequent changes that are made in these agreements. This consequently places significant power in the hands of international authorities, such as the United Nations, and New Zealanders are effectively powerless to stop these decisions. Free trade agreements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership are also highly contentious, with a number of concerned unions, groups and individuals organising themselves to oppose this free trade agreement.
And Canada have been invited to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which is an ambitious 21st century trade agreement that will now include 11 countries.
In this respect, international laws and free trade agreements add to New Zealand's democratic deficit, with citizens having little, if any, input about the decision-making process. And this simply doesn't happen in nations like Switzerland, who must approve such decisions in a nationwide referendum that is binding on the government. As is the case with many nations around the world, the internet has become intricately entwined in the lives of New Zealanders, both at individual and institutional levels. According to an AUT University study in 2009, 83% of New Zealanders use the internet on a daily basis, the vast majority of these having broadband. Expanding internet access and internet speed is now officially supported by the New Zealand government, which has embarked on an initiative to install ultra-fast broadband to 75% of New Zealanders over the next 10 years. This represents a massive investment in the upgrade of infrastructure, which is estimated by government to cost up to $1.5 billion, acknowledging the growing importance of the internet to New Zealanders. Yet, to date, no progress has been made on the use of internet voting, even though it's been successfully used in Switzerland, Estonia and New South Wales and Australia. Although there may be some general concern from the public, the following clip from Geneva in Switzerland highlights the extent of the security that is used in the process. The New Zealand government needs to immediately address this inadequacy in the New Zealand voting system.
For your safety, we encrypt your personal data to make it unbreakable in any circumstances. We then transport it to a server that is totally secure. The way is paved with threats, but our guards watch out devices and alarms, protect you and inform us of any unlawful attempt. The voting session opens after our databases have confirmed that your voting card number is valid. With a 16-digit identification number, you have only one possibility out of 5 billion to pass this roadblock by chance. You now enter the heart of the system. The digital world protects your vote.
New Zealand has had a long history with the use of referendums, when it voted triennially between 1894 and 1989 on alcohol licensing. But it wasn't until February 1994 that the Citizens-Initiated Referenda Act came into force, although referendums were non-binding on the government, a serious deficiency in a modern democracy such as New Zealand. This effectively means citizens-initiated referendums can and have been ignored. To date, there have only ever been 4 successful citizens-initiated referendums in New Zealand, probably because the threshold to trigger a referendum has been set extremely high by international standards to discourage the practice. In 1995, the New Zealand Professional Firefighters Union referendum asked the question: should the number of professional firefighters employed full-time in the New Zealand Fire Service be reduced below the number employed in January 1, 1995? 87.8% said no. The government chose to ignore the referendum results. In 1995, Margaret Robertson initiated a referendum that asked the question: should the size of Parliament be reduced from 120 members of Parliament to 100 by reducing the number of list MPs from 55 seats to 35 seats? 81.5% said yes. The government chose to ignore the referendum results. In the same year, Norm Withers, after his elderly mother was almost bashed to death in his shop, initiated a referendum that asked the question: should there be a reform of our justice system, placing greater emphasis on the needs of victims, providing restitution and compensation for them, and imposing minimum sentences and hard labour for all serious violent offences? 91.8% said yes. The government chose to ignore the referendum results. In 2009, after the government supported the passing of an anti-smacking bill introduced to Parliament by Green MP Sue Bradford, which banned parents from smacking their children, Cheryl Saville and Larry Baldock, a former United MP, collected enough signatures to trigger a referendum that asked the question: should a smack as part of good parental correction be a criminal offence in New Zealand? 87.4% said no, and yet again the government chose to ignore the wishes of New Zealanders. This led to a public display of dissatisfaction, with thousands marching down Auckland's Queen Street, but nothing changed. These are serious concerns that highlight a democratic deficit and a lack of checks and balances in the New Zealand political system, and many New Zealanders are now asking themselves, when is enough enough? What can be done about this sorry state of affairs? There is certainly more than one way to govern ourselves, other than the perpetual cycle of elect then regret, as our governments fall short of their promises. Well, there is a better way. Switzerland has had the answer for over 130 years: binding referendums. But Switzerland isn't the only country using this system of direct democracy as a political tool to control their politicians. Direct democracy is a concept that a growing number of citizens and states around the world are exploring and embracing. There are 190 million people in Switzerland, Italy, Liechtenstein, and 24 states in the USA who now embrace the referendum system, with 70% of the US population now living in a state that gives them the right to vote on initiatives and referendums. Binding referendums are a check and balance on Parliament and the government, and it's up to each and every New Zealander to demand the right to make important decisions when they believe it's important to do so.